In this segment, I want to talk to you about the compliance piece of the journey to a meaningful and compliant IEP. If you're not familiar with IEP compliance, we do have a general overall compliance under IDEA, but we also have a specific compliance that's related to transition. And that compliance is under our what we call our state performance plan, our annual performance review indicators. The indicator that's specifically related to compliance with the transition components of the IEP is indicator 13. Some of you may have heard of it before. Some of you may have heard of it with a lot of stress around it because there is funding associated with the compliance for indicator 13, but the object of indicator 13 is really to create a better IEP for students. So let's actually take a look at what indicator 13 is. This is the description of it pulled from the IDEA federal regs. So it has to do with looking at those transition age IEPs and identifying if they have appropriate measurable post-school goals, if those post-school goals have been updated annually, if the transition assessments that were used to develop the post-school goals were based on age-appropriate transition assessments, and we'll get into what that is later. Also, if they have identified transition services, and those services are related to the post-secondary goals, and if they have a course of study laid out that will support that student in attaining those post-secondary goals. And then if their annual goals are linked to the post-secondary goals. So that's the big part of indicator 13. As we go through the process, we actually will be reviewing IEPs for these components. We're also going to be making sure that we have evidence that the student was invited to the IEP team meeting. As I said in our previous video, transition services are required to begin at age 16. So at that point, you would also be inviting the student to attend the IEP meeting. They're not required to attend, but it is required that we invite them to the meeting. And then if there are any members of outside agencies that might be in the need to know of the student's IEP or participate in the meeting to provide some of that transition to those post-secondary services, we have some guidelines around how we document if we got permission for those agencies to attend the meeting, if they were invited to the meeting, and then whether or not they attended. So those are the big components of the indicator 13. Our Technical Assistance Center in the area of transition, it's the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, or we call it NTAC. I know you all have had experience with that up to this point. It seems like everything we're doing is around NTAC. And as we spoke in a different module, the indicator 13 component actually was associated with NSTAC, our National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center. They were that federally funded assistance center that focused only on indicator 13, but now they're part of that NTAC group. But when it was NSTAC, they developed a checklist of the items that we just went over in indicator 13. So they broke it down into a checklist, and this is a checklist that a lot of states use. There's a more defined version of it, which you actually have access to those in your module. And states will take this and they will review IEPs in districts. Some states have what they call compliance teams that go out to the districts and will do those compliance reviews. So they will be going through either all of your IEPs at the secondary level if you're a small district, or they might take a sampling of IEPs if you're a larger district. But they're going to be checking for whether or not you've met these indicator 13 components. This is information that they have to report to the federal government. So they are very diligent typically about getting this information. In some states, they do it different ways. In Colorado, years ago, we were low on our compliance. We needed to work on that across the state. So we did have a compliance team that would go out to districts and do this work. Now we have actually increased our compliance, and we have shifted our focus onto one of the other indicators, indicator 14, which I know you learned about in your first module. But what happened with that shift was now schools are actually doing their compliance reviews themselves and then reporting that to the state. The state does monitor and do some checks to make sure that the data that's being reported is correct. So different states may do it different ways, but it's information that they have to report to the federal government. So it is happening everywhere across the country. But what does it mean to have an indicator 13 compliant IEP? Obviously, it has to address these components in the checklist, but the idea of indicator 13 isn't just about making sure that that plan is well written. It's about making sure that that plan is well written so that we know that students are receiving better services. Some of the research that we've seen on compliance and IEPs, one thing we see showed that a connection between indicator 13 compliant IEPs existed with higher enrollment in post-secondary education. So that was one thing saying that if we had a stronger IEP, that we saw that the students were making that transition into post-secondary education. Another study showed that non-compliance with indicator 13 meant that students were not necessarily receiving the services that they need in order to reach post-secondary goals. And then there was some other data that showed that 40% of students nationally didn't have a relationship between their post-school goals and their course of study and transition services when IEPs were reviewed. And again, that might be an indicator that students aren't receiving the services that they need or are not enrolled in the courses that they need to be taking to help them work towards having the skills necessary to attain their post-secondary goals. We'll go into talking more about post-secondary goals and each of these pieces of indicator 13 because we're going to go through them and look at how we develop those IEPs by developing each part of that. So good planning is good planning. We have to have it. If we don't have good planning, we may not head in the direction that we want to head. And when we look at other reasons why it's important that we have these strong IEPs beyond indicator 13, which is our IDEA saying you have to have these components in the IEP, when we look at litigation, we have found over time that we are not responsible for whether or not our students actually achieve their post-secondary goals. The piece that we are responsible for is making sure that there's what we call a viable plan, that the plan that we create is very clear and specific on the steps that need to be taken in order to reach those post-secondary goals. If a student were to graduate and not reach their post-secondary goals, which is what has happened in litigation, and that student then come back to the school district and say, you did not provide me the services that I needed because I did not reach my goals, we are not liable for whether or not that student reaches their goals. But if you look back at the IEP at that point, and you can see that there is a link between the annual goals and the post-secondary goals and the course of study and the post-secondary goals, and we can see that we have a strong plan that would, the wording is reasonably enable that student to reach their goals, then we can say that we did all that we could and we would not be held accountable for that student not reaching their post-secondary goals. But if we did not have a strong plan, that would be different. We would be held accountable for not having a plan in place that would potentially prepare that student for their future education, employment, or independent living environments. So there is that legislation piece of why we have to have strong transition plans. And then there's this litigation piece of needing to have strong transition plans. And it's really hard to take something that should be a document that's supporting kids, but take it down to this level of legislation and litigation. But those are just the facts of it. That is what it comes down to. But ultimately, as I keep saying, when we look at these pieces, we're really trying to make a better IEP for our students. And I put together this Wordle because I want to go back to this idea of a meaningful IEP. If we are looking specifically at the students' ideas for their post-secondary education, their post-secondary employment, and potentially their post-secondary living situation. And if we are looking at their needs that make them eligible for special education services, and we take into account all of those things and think about how we're going to support that student in developing the skills that they need to be able to function in that next environment after they leave high school, we really are making an IEP that is more meaningful to them. It specifically relates to their needs, it specifically relates to their interests, and it specifically relates to their dreams and desires that they have post high school. So again, we use the word meaningful. We've thrown around different ideas. That's why I threw out all these words, but they all can come back to meaning the same thing, that it's a relevant IEP, that it makes sense to the student, it's valid, it's connected with what they want to do, it's direct, it's related, it's authentic, it's worthwhile. All of these things are the things that we want to strive for in creating a transition-focused IEP that is going to help support the students meeting their post-secondary goals. So that's the last thing I want to say about that, but I want you to keep that in mind as you think about IEPs, as you go through your assignments for this module and you are reviewing the IEPs for the Indicator 13 components. And then also if you are developing IEPs using the tools that we will talk about a little bit later.